So last year, one of the projects that we were commissioned for at our studios, Surfing Light Beams, was called Kinship Wayfinder. And that was commissioned by the More Than AI Sandbox that Watershed in Bristol and My World were running. And we were one of 6 projects commissioned to create an innovative prototype that explored the creative possibilities of AI. And Watershed were running a whole season of work around, kind of other forms of intelligence, not just machine learning. So that really inspired the kind of direction that all of the 6 project teams were taking and were commissioned to make. And Kinship Wayfinder, the prototype, was basically a forest experience that you play in teams, and you get to explore a forest, and find out what happened to a team of scientists that mysteriously vanished in the forest 30 years ago. And with a lot of the projects that I work on when I make my own projects, I think I really like to focus on the really, really big problems that quite often can't be solved by the end of like that development cycle, or when you launch it for public playtesting, or when you finish, there's still so many questions that are left unanswered. So the question at the backbone of Kinship Wayfinder was, how can AI help create meaningful connections with one another in the real world? And that's a massive question. It's absolutely huge. And the sandbox was only a 3.5 month rapid research and development period. So actually, it was super, super intense, really, really condensed. I was working with a new team of people that had put together especially for this project. And so you kind of find yourself in this space where you're trying to answer this really, really big question, but you also know you've got to make a thing and you've got to test a thing, and you actually want people to have like a really meaningful experience. You want them to come away and remember the thing that you made because there's an intention behind it. So actually for us, we sat in the problem space for quite a while, which was probably about 4 weeks, probably like 2 weeks too long, where we were just kind of thinking about all of the assumptions around what AI is, how people feel about it. This was last year in May, so a lot of that landscape has already changed. But we also wanted to work, in green spaces and help people come together. So we wanted to create this beautiful experience with, surrounded by trees. So we did some initial user testing and some research, and then we made a thing. But what was really interesting was the first thing that we thought we were going to make, we kind of chucked it out of the window straight away. We were just like, we're going to need to ask our audience members who are playing in the forests. We're going to need too much data off them, too much personal information, and actually there's too much mistrust around AI. So we just chucked that off straight away. So eventually, when we got to our first play test where we'd made a thing, you could play it on your mobile phones. It was really playful, it was collaborative. The teams were invited to walk around, find things, solve puzzles. Um, we were doing a couple of things as a team. We had, our developers checking that all the tech was working. We had people checking what the flow of the people were like as they were going around. We had our behavioral scientists observing what was actually happening in terms of like their user experience. And interestingly, that first playtest, a lot of the stuff didn't work. The tech didn't work. Nobody knew what they were doing. The user experience, so the story world and the gaming was too complicated. The buttons didn't work, so the actual interface of like using everything on the mobile phones was just way too complex. And you kind of come away from that and you kind of go, there's so much that didn't work, like we've got to redesign everything. But there's always good things, because you hopefully do that initial playtest with people that you trust, and we were definitely playtesting with the community of like residents, around the Pervasive Media Studio in Bristol. So we had like critical friends, which we knew we could kind of lean into. And some of the things that were really positive was actually people were playing, they were enjoying the puzzling, and it was really collaborative. But actually, no one was making any real connections, and this big question that we had, can AI help people create meaningful connections in the world? We were like, because we spent such a long time in that problem space, kind of going, people are lacking social connections, really deep and meaningful social connections. There's lots of superficial connections, but how can we create that space where people can come together and feel like it's been more than just a fleeting moment. And so actually we were like, it's not enough. It's not enough to just create a puzzling gaming experience in a green space. And nobody was looking at the trees, nobody was looking at the green spaces. So actually there was a lot that worked, but there was a lot that didn't work. Um, and so we took all of that feedback, all of the observations, all of the things that didn't work, and we basically did a massive slash and burn. We literally turned around and we went, we have to redesign it. And by this point, we were about probably 5 or 6 weeks in. So we're probably like in the middle of this R&D development phase and thinking we've got, you know, 6 weeks left or thereabouts before we have to do a big industry showcase. So actually there was lots and lots of challenges. I make it sound like it was really easy. It wasn't. It was brutally painful. It's not great when you make things and they don't work, because in your head you have this vision that, the angels will sing straight away. And actually to create those kinds of experiences, you have to really, work through the weeds to find out, how people really respond and how they care and how they connect. And also we were working in a green space. Our parameters for making this thing wasn't just on a device or, in a headset. We were kind of like working with lots of unknowns and variables. That meant that actually our playtesting was really, really crucial, because we had to see what people were doing and where we sat with them. And for a lot of people, you could tell it was going to become a throwaway experience. So we did a really brutal slash and burn where we redesigned everything. So we spent the summer kind of rethinking about all the stuff that meant, was important. How do you create that feeling when you finish doing an experience that stays with you? And it doesn't have to be like, oh, it changed my whole life, but it might be just one moment where someone shared something with you in an experience, and actually you shared something with them, and it becomes something that stays in your memory as a moment. And we had to peel back all the layers. And actually, most of those layers were the tech layers. There was too much tech and it was too complicated. So we had to strip away all the layers and really bring it back to what is the story and the gameplay within the trees, and how do we get people to navigate that space so that they can take a moment and breathe and pause, and what happens when we go to the next version, which again still had lots of problems. By the time we got to the next version, which was kind of like late August, so this is probably with about 4 weeks left, we had a completely different set of experiences. We brought in props and we brought in things that people got to share and explore, and it just turned it into a richer experience. But to move from that kind of initial point of we don't know what we're making, and we don't know how to solve this big problem, to we've made a thing and some of it worked, but it wasn't good enough. We're looking for that wow moment and it's not there. And how do we go back to the essence of what this project really is about, which is this story and this play in the forest that brings people together? And how does the technology and the AI facilitate that? And then getting to the point at the end where actually um, people were having a really great time. People were laughing and they were sharing moments about their lives, and they were playing and they were trying to work out what happened to these scientists that disappeared in the forest. um, but in order to get to that point, we probably play tested about 3 times, and each time we play tested, we were mining all of the insights, all of the feedback, all of the stuff that worked, all of the stuff that didn't work. We were being really brutal about our decision making, i.e., this isn't going to work, we need to remove that. Or actually, people won't sit there and do that because they'll get bored. I
Yeah.
think what it also made me realize, not being a technologist, is we take for granted when we do experiences, or even when we're just on our phones and we're playing, we've got an app on our phone or we're playing a mobile game, and really good user experiences and really good like interaction with the app. It's seamless and it's flawless, and the moment it doesn't work, people get frustrated really easily. So we really had to simplify everything back down again, and actually that was where the expertise of the team came in, to make sure that we were making something that people liked rather than disliked.
Thank you. That's such a good setup. So it really talked about all those different stages, the different people involved. There's loads there that I'd like to come back to a bit later on. I think I'll pick some of that up. But can I bring Ben in for just now? So we're sort of starting by thinking about, what is this like in your working life? How do you deal with the unexpected? And so there are lots of questions to come back to. Thank you, Harmeet. Um, and Ben, we're really pleased that you can join us again. You want from the world of creative technology, but you'll say a bit more about your background and world. Before I go on to ask you a question, can I ask you to describe yourself physically as Harmeet did?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm Ben Neal. I'm a creative technologist. I'm a 45-year-old white man with short blonde hair and a beard. I'm currently wearing a jumper in a kind of office setting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're really looking forward to hearing about sort of some of the kind of approaches that you apply in your creative work. I wonder if you'd sort of give us a little bit of an explanation as to your background and how you deal with the unexpected in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, going back to sort of when I was a lot younger, about 20, was kind of in fine art. So I had that art background, and went through university drawing and painting and making videos and performance and all sorts of things, and eventually ended up doing some programming work, and that kind of took on more prominence as I needed to kind of like get paid, and it was a lot easier to make websites for people and make money that way than it was to sell paintings and so on. So I've yeah, for quite some time now, over 20 years, been working on art projects to provide kind of technology skills to really visualize the ideas of lots of other people. So that's what I get paid for kind of day to day. So I work with lots of different artists, art organizations and projects to sort of transform these interesting ideas into finite working functional projects, and often software and hardware and electronics. But yeah, I'm a programmer essentially, but I work in the arts.
With an arts background. And how do you deal with what's your experience of kind of dealing with the unexpected in your work?
Yeah, it's a very everyday thing. Typically, people approach me with a kind of loose idea of the sort of thing that they want to explore, but they're not quite sure how to go about achieving that. And this is the same. I co-run a studio as well, so I co-run a mixed reality performance studio called Displace, and it's a similar process when I'm working with other people and when I'm producing my own work with my sort of co-lead Kerry Wise, who's runs Displace with me. And so we start off with loose kind of ideas, and then there's a kind of pipeline that transforms that bit by bit into a project. But it's often quite a long, drawn-out process with a good bit at the beginning where you're excited and buzzy about the possibilities of what this thing could be and how it could work. And then there's quite a long section in the middle where there's lots of complicated technical kind of shaping that goes on, and lots of programming work and building and testing. And eventually that gets more and more refined. And at the end of it all, you typically end up with something that you put in front of an audience, and then it's good enough to be seen, in a gallery or a festival or something. So it's kind of like a prototyping to, a release level product in a very, very condensed time span, which you do get in science and you do get in, for releases for professional products and stuff. But in the arts, it's typically done on quite small budgets in quite small time spans. And so it's very intense, and it's very exciting though. There's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of innovation, and the art and creativity brings a lot of fresh approaches to the technology stuff, which is often quite well established and used, broadly in all sorts of different industries.
Yeah. Go on. We're going to carry on.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things which go wrong all the time. So
Yeah.
it's a constant problem solving endeavor trying to get things off the ground. So a really recent project that we've been working on with the space is a project called Replica, which started off as a kind of 50 grand pitch, which we didn't get the money for, and we tried a few different places to get the funding for, and eventually the space funded us, but the actual budget for it was much less than we'd initially planned. So we had to bake it down from this grandiose, original project to a slightly smaller one. So Replica, just to give you some background on the project, is a mixed reality, with sort of hollow duet, we're calling it. So you meet a dancer, a performer in a room on your own. You sit down at a table and you wear a VR headset, and you see opposite you a real woman, and through the VR headset you can see the room that you're in, but also like a holographic virtual version of the same woman. And then these, the virtual and the real woman dancers perform around you, and you're right in the center of the experience as the only audience member. And so we're looking at touring this, and it wasn't without its own problems that you get to make this kind of stuff. So there's all sorts of problem solving that we had to do in regards to that project. So, for example, the live dancer has no way of seeing what the audience member sees. So we had to develop like a whole process by which she could rehearse and know where this invisible person was in the room and in the space with her. So we use a combination of spatial cues, so these little markers on the floor, sound cues, so she's got some sound within the audio, within the music, to tell her where this invisible person is at all times. Now, of course, she's like a performer, as a professional dancer, so she's well rehearsed as well. So she's effectively retracing her steps in real life, along with her kind of digital double. So this is the form that a lot of projects take, in that you're kind of inventing the process to suit the project. And you have to do a lot of lateral thinking and inventive, creative, like, how are we going to achieve this kind of thinking? And that tends to happen in the early stages, where you're doing the experimentation and the R&D type work, where it's a good time to like take the risks, try different approaches and see what works. And then once you've got an idea about what's working and what's not working, you can start the longer kind of tech development process in the middle, where there's typically a lot of heads down programming work that needs to be done. But hopefully at the end of all this, when you've sort of like grit your teeth and gone through the drawn out, quite complicated process of making this work, you have something to show to an audience, and you have that wonderful moment where you present it to people, and it makes it all worthwhile, basically. But there's all sorts of issues with this type of work. So like being well rehearsed and being well planned, especially with live events, is real benefit. I think it's always good to like not overcook it and have a little bit of freshness and leave space for some flexibility, but you want like a good, well rehearsed routine that will keep everything running smoothly, even if there are kind of little bumps in the road. And sometimes you need to find kind of like quick and dirty fixes that will just patch up something that went wrong. But sometimes you're also at the mercy of, fate. And so, for example, one of the things that went wrong with the VR headset is we use a technique called volumetric capture, which is where we sort of film someone and then that turns them into a kind of virtual version of themselves. But the VR headset that we used had an update. So Meta, who make the headsets, Meta, the giant company who do WhatsApp and Instagram and all that stuff, updated the headset operating system, and it meant that the volumetric capture software just ceased to function. And that was across all products that used that. So it wasn't just our work that was affected. There was like a huge range of people's work that they'd already made that suddenly stopped working. And of course, that was completely out of our hands. Now, luckily, they fixed it fairly quickly, but it's not uncommon for things that are completely out of your control to just suddenly turn against you. Typically, they get fixed and there's normally a way around it, but it certainly had me spend probably like 2 or 3 days wondering what I'd done to break it. And it turned out that it actually wasn't me at all. And another thing that happened was another feature didn't work, and I'd spent days and days trying to work out why it wasn't rendering properly. And it turned out that the company, it was kind of like a bug fix. So we had to get in touch with the company that made the software and say, why isn't this working? And they said, oh, well, it doesn't, but we can fix it for you. So some of this stuff is really difficult to fix, but there's obviously a lot of stuff that you do have capacity to fix. And yeah, a lot of my time is spent problem solving and digging through all this stuff, really making it happen. And there are times where it gets too much. So there was a project that I made, which was a large 8-player sort of sound game, and it was designed for public use by 8 people. But ultimately, like, people kept bringing all their kids along, and they were so rough with the equipment that it just, every time we took it out to a festival, it would break, and then we would spend 4 days having to fix it just to get it back out. And it just, in the end, I think we got so tired of fixing the broken artwork that we just gave up taking it out. So yeah, sometimes it's good to know when to say no as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, loads and loads of points to pick up on later in terms of the different steps of the process, you know, how you keep your spirits up in that sort of the less exciting middle bit when you're doing all of the work. And also they will kind of come back later to thinking about audiences and how both of you have talked about, you have this idea and then it goes in front of an audience and there's other unexpected things going on as well. So we'll pick all of that up later. If anybody has any questions for Harmeet, there's a question that was sort of kind of aimed at you in the chat already, but any other questions to Ben and Harmeet will be fab. You can add them into chat now and we'll come back to them. And in the meantime, I'm going to invite Louise to join us. So Louise is our third panelist. Hello, Louise. Hello. Would you like to give a physical description of yourself, and then I'll kind of kick off with the questions?
Yeah, sure. So morning, everyone. I'm Louise. I am a white woman in my mid to late 30s with long dark brown hair, my signature flick eyeliner and some pink lipstick.
Thanks, Louise. So I'm going to ask you to kick off by telling us about the making of your work, Fame Hungry. So I guess you'll give us a little bit of context to Fame Hungry, the project in itself. And then you've sort of described some of the twists and turns that have happened in which Fame Hungry still is an ongoing project, isn't it? Some of the twists and turns which you described to me as 3 bombshells when we were speaking about it beforehand. And I'm sort of going to get you to give us a little bit of setup, tell us what those were, and a little bit of kind of what happened as a result of them. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm a performance artist by trade, so I am going to tell you a bit about the bombshells in this project, but let's just say I am also an artist who's excited about the notion of playing with bombshells as well. I'd say a lot of my work plays with like notions of liveness and risk. And yeah, so anyway, Fame Hungry is as Linda said, is an ongoing project. Fame Hungry is a show which came from, I guess, bombshell number 1, which was basically me as a performance artist at the age of 37, I think it was, basically losing my whole live art practice during the pandemic. So like many artists at that time, I lost all recourse to audiences. And I guess also, you know, I reached that point in my career where I was kind of wondering, like, whether I was doing the right thing, whether the live arts were going to continue, and basically whether I needed to pivot. It was around that time that I was doing a sort of series of like drama workshops for young people. And around that time, I met this 15-year-old Gen Z TikToker called Jax, who basically told me about how they had a TikTok following of 50,000 people. And at the time, I guess it just completely blew my mind. I just remember thinking, right, well, here I am wondering whether I've got a future in the arts. And here's this young person who's essentially performing daily to an audience of 50,000 people. And yeah, I guess it basically got the cogs turning for me of wondering whether I should pivot, whether I should start. I'd always had elements of digital practice within the work that I was making. but it definitely got me thinking, you know, is this an opportunity? I mean, I wasn't the first person during the pandemic to think, should I should I open a TikTok account? I'm sure. But it definitely got me thinking, is this the way that I should be thinking about my career going? So Fame Hungry started with this question, which basically was like, is performance art dead? Can I find an audience online? And I devised a kind of social experiment, which was what happens when a millennial performance artist gets mentored by a Gen Z TikToker. And basically, like with many of my shows, this show had a really long sort of incubation slash research phase where basically me and Jax would meet up online on Zoom, and they would mentor me and they helped me grow a TikTok following. And then essentially the sort of story of that relationship and then the next bit became the sort of basis for the show. The show's quite complicated but quite exciting in terms of like how it works online. So it essentially is a show which goes out every night to two audiences. So I perform in front of a live theatre audience, but also simultaneously on my phone to a TikTok audience. And the show, basically, the sort of notion of it is that it's a game. And every night I'm going live to these two audiences, and the theatre audience get to witness me playing a game with this TikTok audience, which is essentially get me to, I believe it's 30,000 likes now, and I'll do something amazing for you. And then this sort of game that I play with the TikTok audience gets witnessed by the live theatre audience. And essentially this game becomes a kind of metaphor for my existential crisis and whether I feel like I can survive this career in the arts. And Jax performs with me nightly on Zoom. And then, yeah, all these sorts of things happen on TikTok. But yeah, I guess, like, as I said, I'm a performance artist, so I'm really interested in like playing games around like, which get me to kind of make a research question as live as possible, let's just say. So often I like having as much risk and liveness within that question as possible. But yeah, I guess TikTok, with it comes like lots of unexpected things. You know, it's definitely a platform which anyone who's been on TikTok knows. You're always trying to play a game with the algorithm of like trying to figure it out and trying to figure out how to get the most views, or, you know, how to maintain those views, or, you know, it's also one of the platforms. And this is why I loved using it as part of this show. I'd say it's like the biggest and baddest and kind of most curious of all the social platforms out there, in that it does have all these kind of secret rules to it. And what I found when I was kind of trialing this live work, Fame Hungry, was that those kind of rules or those goalposts for the show, for TikTok, kept changing. So yeah, I found very quickly that we were having to change nightly, having to change the way that we played this game, basically. And that was, you know, anything from making sure the sort of things that people know about TikTok. So making sure you don't swear, but also finding out that different types of imagery might get you kicked off. So one of the things that I do in the show is I sort of repeat this monotonous kind of inane TikTok dance over and over. But very quickly, when we first started performing it, I realized that there were certain motifs that were in the dance which would get me kicked off. And this this became one of the biggest battles when we were doing the show in Edinburgh. So I should say that this show's been touring for almost 2 years now. And so we've had to change quite a lot of the things that we do in the show, like over the course of that touring life. But it was in Edinburgh last year, which was the first time when we'd been doing the show nightly, where this game that we were playing with the algorithm, you know, metaphorical and literal game, became quite intense. So basically, to give an example of one of the difficulties of this game was in Edinburgh, I was getting kicked off nightly, off the live stream, mid-show, for what did they call it? Violating community guidelines for sexual content. Now, I just want to be really, really clear. There's no sexual content in the show, but I was being told over and over that what I was doing looked like sexual content. And so, yeah, basically, this is an example of, you know, one of the things that I had to tweak. And, you know, it was quite exciting for the show because, you know, the live audience gets to see me being kicked off. And again, this becomes a metaphor for like how to survive in the arts. But you know, we had to keep tweaking things because obviously a little bit of jeopardy, as I speak about in the show, is good and is exciting, but too much jeopardy, you know, the whole thing just implodes on itself. So there were various things that we had to do, you know, tweaking the style of performance to also having like multiple backup accounts. You know, one of the things was I found that TikTok were kind of, after a while, they were following me. So they found that they could see that some of my backup accounts were connected. So, you know, it was all, it's sort of this game of like basically trying to evade the TikTok algorithm, the TikTok censors, which was quite fun. So yeah, I would say the whole sort of journey of Fame Hungry so far has been this game of, you know, how do I keep my art online in a way that's safe and has this exciting level of jeopardy, but also doesn't have so much risk involved that the whole thing comes collapsing down around me. One of the other things that I spoke to Linda about when we were prepping for this talk was also, I think, one of the other massive bombshells that hit the show was when we took the show out to New York earlier in this year. So it was January 2025. And we happened to be flying to New York on the day of the TikTok ban. Now, if anyone remembers this TikTok ban, this was quite a short-lived TikTok ban. But again, it was enough to really sort of, you know, scare us, the whole production team. I think we were at Heathrow waiting for our flight, and it was something 5 in the morning. And we were in the lounge watching BBC telling us all that TikTok had gone dark that morning. And so then, you know, this was another way that me and my production manager had to go like, oh God, what are we doing? You know, do we use a VPN blocker? Do we have to change to a different platform? And then, you know, funnily enough, by the time we got out to New York, I think the TikTok ban was basically over. But there was still this definite level of jeopardy there of, you know, was Trump going to rescind on, you know, saving TikTok, and, you know, would we have to sort of pivot yet again? But yeah, I guess that was another example of, you know, with all the different ways that we've pivoted, this was another example of like, okay, how can we pivot here, but also can we make this jeopardy and this pivot part of the story of the show? Because, you know, yet again, this was a really great way of, you know, what was happening in digital culture and the arts in general, using the story of that to talk about what's happening to artists now. What does it mean to be an artist now? How do we survive in sort of hyper-capitalist censorious systems? So, you know, yes, we did manage to do the show on TikTok over in New York, but it was essential for us to make this new challenge part of the story then. And so we did, you know, keep talking about it. And I definitely had to keep making terrible jokes about how Trump was sponsoring the show, which went down like a bit of a clanger most nights in New York.
And so in a way, you're sort of, you know, we're talking about kind of embracing the unexpected. What you're saying is that it becomes part of your work, that
Yes.
the changes become part of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like I said, so I'm a performance artist. So to
Yeah.
some extent, I do have this relationship with risk and liveness where, you know, things going wrong is helpful to me, and it's often helpful to the work, and it keeps that relationship between me and the audience who's witnessing this event or this artwork, it keeps it really live. But yeah, it's always about how to pivot in an interesting way, and not in a way which is, yeah, going to make the whole thing come crashing down around me.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you. Harmeet, what about you? You know, we're sort of talking about how, you know, using the unexpected. Is that part of your practice as well? When something unexpected happens to you, so kind of you make use of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I think for me, you know, well, not just for me, right? I think, you know, human beings, we're creatures of habit, and we like to organize everything. We like to organize our things, our relationships, our work. You know, we like to organize the world in certain ways, you know, and actually the world is like definitely measured in, you know, what we can deliver and the outputs. So to sit in that space of like experimenting and testing and embracing the unexpected, you know, to kind of like mine all of those deep insights, you know, when I say insights, the things that go wrong and really like send your adrenaline through the roof, you know, actually to do that it's not behavior that we're quite often used to, because we're so focused on, there has to be an outcome, there has to be an output, we have to deliver to this. We're so used to like setting ourselves up to a standard that we need to deliver on, whether that's as an artist, in a team, in an organization. But I think there's lots of things that you can do to like help build that behavior, like, and hearing some of the things that Ben and Louise are talking about, even if you're not working in performance, or you're not working, at the sharp end of tech, you can still embrace those behaviors to try and embed something new. And what's really worked for us, as a team, quite often the team that I work with changes every project that I work on, because I'm looking for people with specific like expertise that I don't have. Is like to do like daily scrums and stand-ups and stuff, which is very much kind of like a tech corporate culture kind of behavior. um, and it doesn't have to be like you have a stand-up or a scrum every morning. Although if you've got, a massive project and you've got a massive, like deadline, then you probably are. But it's basically just a moment for your team to get together right at the beginning of the day, and check in and go like, where are we at in terms of the development? What is happening on, the programming, the visuals, the performance, the UX, all of this. And what problems do you have? And then each person goes, well, I don't know what the hell I'm doing over here, because I don't know, I never knew what I was doing in the first place. And then the team kind of helps solve it. And and then what are you aiming for the next, like for the next few days or by the end of the week? And then we check in and go, okay, this is where we're at. We'll show visuals or sound or audio before we go to that playtesting moment. So we're not just working in a silo, we're actually working together. And obviously, because we're now very much on the Zoom age, a lot of that stuff happens remotely, but the more that can happen in person, the better it is, definitely. But I think those kind of check-ins of going, where are you at and what the problems you're facing today, like right now in this bit of work that you're doing, and how can we solve that together, so that you don't end up like 5 days in and you've wasted 5 days of your developer's time, or 5 days of your, sound person's time or something, or your writer's time, because they don't know what they're doing, because you're working on all this new stuff that doesn't quite fit. You kind of got these bits of jigsaw that don't fit together.
Have you got is there a link or something that you could find that would sort of show people like Scrum or stand-ups and how they work? Is there a simple description somewhere, that because it might be new to some people?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Thank you.
I'll find one and I'll stick that in. But I think that's really useful, and it means you don't end up going down a rabbit hole too far down and wasting a lot of time, because often you just have to do stuff quickly, and your whole team are working on something autonomously, but it has to come together. And I think some of the other stuff that's really important is just like being able to pick up the team, like, so many things aren't working, and actually being able to lean in is really important, but also knowing that who is the person that's going to pick someone up when actually it's just not working, when that moment where it absolutely is going wrong, and you just think you're going to make the worst thing ever and nobody's going to see it, or you're going to get slated, or you're going to kind of go, why did I just spend 6 months, or 4 months or whatever making something, and it didn't live up to the expectation. um it's you have to kind of collectively pull the team in, so actually it kind of smashes away the hierarchy that you might normally find in a team environment. And that's because there's no one, well, there obviously someone is always accountable to a funder or to whoever, if you're going to showcase, but actually just kind of like leveling that play field, so you pick everyone up, so that actually if it goes wrong, hopefully the team can solve it. But actually, if it's going wrong and someone in your team is not coping with that pressure or not coping with that playtesting, you can come in and you can pick up that energy again, because if the energy dies, then actually you're not going to be able to get through that development, that process.
Thank you.
I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, and I think we'll come back to that again, because we're sort of thinking both in terms of working in teams and within organisations, and also in what's it like being an individual where you're kind of the responsible person. We'll hear all of that. But there was something that you said there which sort of reminded me of we'd had a question in advance, and I'll put it to Ben, and then Louise might have we'll have to be quite quick, we're coming to the break now. But Ben, the question was, how can we, and it sort of echoes everything that you were sort of saying towards the end, Louise, and what Harmeet was saying. How can we be flexible, innovative, and adapt to change when the sector is in survival mode? Ben, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
It is difficult, especially financially, I think, in the creative sector generally. But my advice sometimes when people, because I do quite highly skilled programming work, and if I worked in a different sector, I could get paid a lot more.
Yeah.
But my response to a lot of this, like, why don't you work for somebody else kind of questions is often that try find value in other things. So maybe you can find like value in learning, you can find value in communicating with people, you can find value in expressing yourself. And these are all things that you can get from working in the creative sector that are not financial, but still make your work worthwhile and enjoyable, and give it purpose. And so it may be that your work is unseen, but it's the most beautiful, work around. It may be that you don't have much of a budget, but you're really communicating with a small group of people and having a big impact and that kind of stuff. So I think when people talk about sort of crisis, they often there's obviously lots of different types of crisis, but a lot of creative practice isn't expensive or difficult to do. All you need is some pens and paper and you're off. You can write a novel, with almost no resources. So there's lots of opportunity currently, especially in technology. A lot of stuff is currently quite cheap and quite available and free. So there's lots of free software, there's lots of free apps, lots of stuff you sort of pay for with your attention in a way, because the companies are making, it's a free service, like things like Facebook and stuff, you don't have to pay a subscription to use, but they're making money on the back of it. There's never really been so much opportunity to use such wonderful tools for such a low price. So use these, you treat these things as an opportunity. When I was at university, I just wrote about virtual reality being a kind of thing that was just happened in like LA laboratories, and I was never going to get to use. And now you can buy a headset for a couple of £100. So artists are incredibly hardworking, very, very resourceful, and can turn, they can scrunch up a piece of paper and put it in the gallery and say, think about this. So if anyone can make do with a lot, I think it's the creative sector. I don't think that excuses the fact that it's underfunded and it's under attack from various, sides, with people trying to kind of push all the goodness out of the creative sector into different industries that are more kind of profit driven. But I do think that in my line of work, I often reframe the kind of creativity as innovation, as research and development, as experimentation. Creative people do new and different things, and there's lots of people with more resources, like bigger companies or universities and stuff, that have the resources but don't have the time to go on that journey to learn about how to do something unique and different and bespoke, and take a different path. I think it's kind of underappreciated, that kind of skill set and that mindset, because partly experimentation is open to failure, and businesses and all this kind of stuff, like, people generally avoid failure, but part of trying things out, a different approach, experimenting, is you will fail sometimes, but resilience is something that will just keep you on track. People that I know that are creative are compelled often to make the work that they make They get so much value from performing. They get so much value from, you know, spending time doing illustrations. They love people's responses to the work that they make or the music they write, or the, you know, and it doesn't have to be, popularity doesn't equal goodness. You know, with our work, we often have quite small audiences because it's like one person at a time, but those people leave feeling very special. And they are moved by it in a way that you wouldn't be if you were in a seated audience of two people. So it's difficult times for sure. There are opportunities with, you know, you can connect to people who are quite distant easily. You know, you can have Zoom conversations with people in different countries. You can send people emails and, you know, direct messages who are similar interests but live, you know, in very remote parts. And there are different spaces and ways that people can come together with digital technology and the internet and so on. So in some ways, there are a million opportunities that, you know, going back sort of 50 years, you would not have a chance with. So times are tough, but times are also very abundant.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Louise, we're going to have a break in a minute. Do you have any last thoughts, anything, any responses to that before we finish up?
Yeah, just to say, I think, you know, I started speaking about Fame Hungry, talking about this sort of existential crisis that I was getting about, you know, whether I was going to survive this moment in the arts and this history, in this moment in history. But I think if anything, if Fame Hungry's taught me anything, it's about, I guess, just to pick up what Ben's saying about resilience, and also how good it is to be nimble sometimes as well. You know, Fame Hungry was made in a moment of me going like, okay, I need to slightly pivot with what I'm doing. You know, how can I reach audiences in different ways? And really, you know, I think about this all the time when I'm performing Fame Hungry, because, you know, I always call it, it's like, it's an existential crisis of a show, but actually it's one of my most popular shows to date. And it is the one that's proven that actually there are audiences out there that still want to see weird, you know, strange bits of performance art, and especially on TikTok as well. You know, I've actually managed to kind of create a bit of a performance art hungry fame club, a performance art hungry fan club on TikTok as well, which has proven to me, yeah, sometimes it's worth being a bit nimble and sort of rethinking your strategy. It also, just really quickly, because I know we want to go to a break, but also makes me think of something that my mentor Stacey Mikishi always used to say, which is about sort of using obstacles, the things that are in your way. She used to say, what's in the way is the way. And it makes me think, you know, that's always a really interesting thing to do, you know, like, what are the obstacles here and how can I actually like use them in an interesting way?
Ben, you know, we've spoken quite a lot about how you work, but is there anything else that you might say or explain to us from your world as a creative technologist that might resonate with all of our audience? Kind of how you work, especially when you're sort of doing something that's new or innovative to you. What are the kind of, is there anything else to add about the steps that you go through and how you approach new projects?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of things that I've sort of developed and sort of got better at over the years. As I say, I've got a kind of fine art background, so I wasn't originally really, you know, my background was much more creative and, you know, spontaneous. And as time has gone on, I've become more and more technical. But I do see both sides of that coin. And that's not always the same for everyone. Like, some people are very much in one camp or the other. So I'm unusual in that I see the creative side as much as the technical side. But yeah, I think, like I said, there's a kind of a pipeline where you start off with lots of open ideas and blue sky thinking, and you should do that. You know, you should, you know, like, aim for the best, but plan for the worst. And there's lots of processes involved in that. So I often have conversations early on in a project about what's the idea, like, what are we trying to achieve, what's the purpose of this, what do we want people to think at the end of it or feel at the end of it. And then in the early stages you go through, you sort of scope that, so you kind of, it's often conversations with people and you want to be kind of on the same page. So you say, this is what I think you want making, and this is what I'm proposing to be made, and this is the approach I'm going to take. But, you know, this is a bespoke, unique, you know, we're experimenting, so it might not work out. And I think you have to be clear in those early stages as well about what you're trying to achieve, but also some of the assumptions that you're making. Like, I'm assuming that there won't be any major snag that means that we're going to miss the deadline. I'm assuming that my approach in this particular area is going to work, but it might not. You know, there might be a problem that means we have to take a different approach. You can't always foresee all the problems, and actually highlighting what your assumptions are in those early stages of a project is really helpful. So you can just so that you can mark, you know, like flag the unknowns and flag the risky bits of the project, and mark up those things that are dependencies and the things that are essential. You know, the things that the project just can't survive without. It's like, if we get the money, it will happen. If the money doesn't come through, then we don't do the project. And there are essential things like this project just won't work without internet. We have to have internet. But then there's a lot of things which are like nice to have, desirable elements, which you want in there, but ultimately there are generally a whole bunch of things that you can cut and still end up with the project. So you might have, there might be like a level of, you know, aesthetic or graphical fidelity or some bolt-on events around it that ultimately you can take out, and it doesn't affect the core project or the core thing that you want to do or make. So I think actually like labeling up your assumptions and those things that are essential, those things that are sort of desirable, but, you know, ultimately you could still do the project without, is good. And I think there's lots of approaches, like just don't overcomplicate it. Harmeet sort of touched on a couple of things which are about communications. You know, I've got an artwork that I went to see in a public museum, and the museum is kind of staffed with invigilators who are volunteers, and no one had communicated with them how to turn the thing on. So when I went to visit, it was unpowered because no one had turned the on switch at the wall. So communication with people is really important all the way through the process. And yeah, try and be clear up front what you're trying to achieve and how you see the project developing. Try and plan and foresee as much as you can, but you know, like, be aware that there are some unknowns. Anything could happen. It's difficult to build in lots of contingency on a kind of like thin budget, but if you can do that, that's a really good thing to do. I often find in my work that the devil is in the detail, so I do try and do like quite a detailed assessment of like what I am aiming to achieve and how I will do that in some detail. But you can't sort of like don't over plan, like don't kill it with planning, because it will never totally work out the way that you decided. But something I have found that's really useful is sort of modular projects. And what I mean by that is you have like a core, this has to happen, you know, set of tasks and set of things. But then you have lots of things that you can add to that to scale up or scale down. So it might be that you are making an artwork and you have to make the artwork, but then you can add another level to that, which is, oh, we'll get someone to do some extra sound that will make it even better. And then, oh, we'll add some advertising budget, which will make it even better. And oh, we'll do a workshop, and that will be really great. And we can talk about the artwork. And so at the center of it, you've got this thing that you're making that you have to have. But then you can kind of like make it bigger and smaller and more expensive and cheaper by adding and taking away blocks. And if you can kind of like keep those blocks, things that you can sort of like bolt on and detach, then you can scale up and down projects to suit your budget, to suit the venue. You know, some places just don't have the space for some things. And then if you get a bigger venue, you've got more room, and all of a sudden you think, wow, okay. And you can also add things later in, you know, like maybe you have like a core set of funding and you have a core performance or whatever. And then you get more funding later on and you think, oh, well, great, well, we'll spend that on extra, you know, set, or we'll spend some more on costumes, or we'll do some more marketing, or we'll employ somebody else to do some other job. So kind of like that modular approach works very well for a lot of the projects that I work on.
Thank you. I'm just flagging. I'm going to ask Louise to join us in a second to sort of talk a bit more about Fame Hungry. But just if there's one last point about sort of really key things that you're thinking through your process.
Yeah, I mean, often, although I work in an area that's very complicated and takes a lot of time and expertise to work in, if you want a bespoke piece of software, it takes quite a long time to make that. But people have a tendency to overcomplicate things as well. So a good example that I'll give you is I did a theatre piece that was in Kenya, and it was built in the UK, and we sent it over there. And what part of the theatre piece wanted was a face tracking scene where there was a face of an actor on screen, and there was like this facial tracking technology. It was too complicated to get that to work in reality, so we faked it, and we didn't tell people it was real face tracking. So like we weren't lying to anyone, but the narrative in the piece didn't need to be real-time high-tech face tracking. It was just part of the narrative of the piece. So long as it looked like it, the message was conveyed in a much simpler way. And people can kind of like overcomplicate things when the core message was really the idea of face tracking rather than actual face tracking.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Ben. And let's bring Louise in. Hiya. So Ben's been talking a lot about kind of processes and the development and spending lots of time thinking about your work. But I was wondering if you do all the thinking, the working out, and then at some point it goes in front of an audience, which is kind of where I'm going to get you to start and think about this. And I'm wondering if you just go back to Fame Hungry and tell us some of the things that happened when you put the work in front of the audience. It's a bit unexpected things that happen.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like I've spoken a bit about, TikTok changing the goalposts. I think, yeah, I mean, it's been I say this about a lot of my work that, I love creating kind of social experiments, I guess, with my work to kind of like test a theory or to really like dig into a question. But yeah, I think the thing about Fame Hungry that's been really interesting is looking at the conventions of the different audiences that are in the room with me. So, one of the sort of things early on, which was really exciting about the work was, I mentioned it goes out in front of 2 different audiences. And obviously, largely, I know what the conventions are of a theatre audience, that they're going to be expected to sit there in the dark, probably with their phones off and laugh in the right places or holler in the right places, da 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 da. With a TikTok audience, it's completely different, So one of the things that happens is that the screen, my phone screen is projected behind me so that the theatre audience can see everything that's happening on that TikTok live stream as it goes on. And yeah, very early on, I realized, wow, this is quite an interesting social experiment that I've devised here, because essentially the TikTok audience are allowed to heckle me all the way through the work. And that's brought with it stuff that's really interesting for the show in terms of being trolled. I mean, one of the things that happens, a bit of a spoiler alert to anyone who does watch the show, but halfway through the show, I'm joined every night by a different TikToker, and that TikToker will bring their own TikTok audience with them. And there was one show in Edinburgh last year where the TikToker who was joining me during the show, it's just a 5-minute segment essentially where I kind of interview them. They were a kind of political activist, and they were being trolled by neo-Nazis during that time last year. And so essentially what happened after that was that I ended up getting trolled by all these neo-Nazis as well. And yeah, so that's one of the kind of examples of kind of, mad things that can happen. But yeah, I think, the other thing is like, you expect to get trolled or you expect to get heckled. One of the things that I didn't expect to happen, as I kind of briefly mentioned earlier, is that Fame Hungry now has a kind of TikTok fan club who watches the show nightly. And one of the things that can happen with that quite sweetly is that you know, I might be doing the first 5 to 10 minutes of the show, and they'll be just saying hi to each other and asking them what they're having for tea or what's been up, you know, going on for them that week. So you get this kind of like weird meta commentary going on during the show, which at the I think when I first started seeing that, I was like, oh God, is this a bit distracting? But then I realized that actually, no, it's actually quite sweet and it's quite nice, because it means that Fame Hungry, the show, the project, the social experiment, has grown a kind of meta sort of culture around it, which now I work into the show. So now I get to see what they're having for tea. I get to tell them what I'm having for tea. You know, it's just, again, it's like an example of how to be nimble. So that's kind of the stuff that's happened on the TikTok audience side. And then just to give you an example of something that I've had to sort of adapt to on the theatre audience side was there was a show last year where we've been touring internationally with the work currently, which is really exciting because again, you get to see, you know, how the work how people respond to it in different international contexts. But I arrived in Denmark last autumn and we were doing 2 shows, and one of them I didn't realize had been basically booked out for a kind of schools audience. And most of the kids there were, I think, between the ages of maybe like 11 to 16, and there were about 200 of them in the audience. So at the beginning of the show, I was thinking, I was doing my, you know, whatever I do in the first sort of 15 minutes of the show. But I sort of had this kind of weird feeling that was growing because I was very much getting the vibe that the normal audience response wasn't happening. There was sort of like heckling, which was coming from the audience in weird places. You know, I always think it's really important as a performer not to get a bit lazy with your audience response. I think sometimes you can sort of learn to get the laughs or the in the same places, and actually it's really good to kind of flex your performance muscles and go like, no, I want to work for those laughs, or I want to be open to the unexpected every night. But anyway, this night it was things were happening in all sorts of different places. And then as the show was going on, I realized that I was being like trolled a bit more than normal on the screen behind me. And I could see that the audience was responding to that. And half of it was in Danish, so I didn't really know what was happening. Anyway, came off stage, was in the was getting changed backstage as I normally do, and sort of thinking, God, that was a weird show. Wasn't quite sure what was happening. Anyway, my production manager at the time came in and said, "Oh my God, are you okay? You know, that was a really rough show." Anyway, she then told me that essentially what had been happening was all the school kids in the audience had basically just whipped out their phones and started going on TikTok and started trolling me from the audience from their phones. And again, you know, that's something that it's not banned in the show. Obviously, if people want to go on TikTok and participate in that way, as well as being in the theatre audience, then that's quite fun for me. But largely, I found that audiences don't do that. And also, I think largely my audiences haven't been of that sort of TikTok age as well. So yeah, again, it was a really interesting thing to happen in terms of the social experiment of the show, because you know, what that taught to me that time was essentially, okay, so kids of a certain age are going to want to go on TikTok. They are going to want to experience it in sort of double time, whereas other audiences haven't wanted to do that. But then the other thing is that they're now seeing that if they comment on the feed, then their peers are going to be responding to it. So essentially, they get to perform in the show alongside me if they participate in that way. So yeah, I mean, I could go on and on and on about all the learnings, but yeah, that was a really interesting one, definitely.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Ben, have you got any comments? Either of you got any comments for each other listening to what you're saying? And I'm going to get Harmeet to come back in as well.
Yeah, it's sort of user testing is actually a really, really important part of a lot of the projects that I work on, because I don't tend to work on sort of software that is not interactive or, you know, runs in the background. So I build stuff that's interactive, that has like a live element, often with, you know, music or, you know, buttons and lights and sensors. But user testing stuff is like super important, because you can't predict what everyone's going to do, and there's always going to be somebody who, you know, lies on the floor or runs around instead of walks, or, you know, picks up an object in a weird way or drops something. So you know, all that kind of stuff about people's behaviors being unpredictable is great to test. So when I make work, I often test it out on not the real audience, for example. So it's like, so I made a kind of thing that was supposed to detect your dance moves. So you'd stand in front of a camera, and then when you make a pose, it played an animation. So it's work by Sean Fan called Glimmer. So I decided to test it on like my friends' children, and they immediately like turned around with their faces away from the camera and did sort of booty shaking dances to try and trigger it off, which was great because it was certainly something that I'd never imagined. You know, you just think clearly people will be looking at the screen. It's obvious that that's what you're supposed to do, and it's actually a good thing that people misbehave, but it's preferable if they can do that in a kind of like user testing, you know, like as the project develops stage, so that you're a bit more ready for it when, you know, you're kind of like at the real event or whatever. But yeah, people are sort of mischievous and curious, and it's not always malicious, but they sometimes are difficult to control.
Good, and which is good, isn't it? It keeps things interesting. Thank you. We've just got 10 minutes left of the webinar, so I'm going to ask Harmeet about sort of listening to what everybody's saying, just thoughts on outcomes. You know, we're talking about different stages of a process. There's kind of development, there's iterations, and then there's the kind of, you know, getting out to the audience. What would you consider? What would you be looking for in terms of good outcomes? I don't necessarily mean successful. I mean, what, you know, what feels like a good outcome at some of those different stages? And I'm just going to ask you to keep it really brief, because then we've got like a final wrap-up question for you all.
Yeah. I mean, outcome-wise, I think, I mean, for me, the question's never going to be solved. That big question is never, it might take a lifetime to solve that question. And quite often as artists, we have millions of questions and they change from project to project, you know, and even in organizations, those questions might be really, really big. You know, how can you develop your audience, for example? But you have to kind of like look at the smallest thing. So the outcome is always, did you get some part of that? Was there some part of that satisfaction at the end? Did your audience come away with a certain feeling? You know, and that's what is always important to me. What value does this have? You know, and why will people care? And that always comes back to the audience experiencing this piece of work, you know. And it's the same in an organization. If you're implementing something new, you know, you might be thinking, how do organizations put work on in a gallery that is more accessible? They've got to go through that period of testing and experimenting in order to kind of go, are we now more accessible, you know, for blind audiences because we've now, you know, installed audio descriptions? And so the outcome is always going to go through that process of testing and experimenting, of challenging those assumptions, like Ben said, of play testing so that you don't go too far down the rabbit hole, of, you know, understanding the, you know, unpredictable nature not only of tech but also of humans who, you know, quite often will do strange things, you know, not just, you know, in a live, you know, show, but also in public spaces. You know, a lot of the work that I do is in public spaces. So the outcomes for me, the good outcomes are, will people remember this in X amount of time, you know? And what will they remember it for? Will they remember it that they wasted an hour of their life that they never get back? Or will they remember the thing that you hope that the experience that you created will leave them with, that they made a connection, or that they felt something in, you know, the VR piece, or that in that moment of that live show in Fame Hungry, that they experienced something that perhaps got them to, you know, that they would never experience in real life before, because you're setting up that jeopardy, that play space. So I think the outcome is always a reflection of that bigger question. And you can embed that whether you're an artist working in a really small way or an organization trying to implement, you know, and embed something, you know, quite radical within an organizational approach that you've never done before. But in the smallest way, because actually those insights will always change as you develop what you're working on for those audiences and developing that experience or that thing.
Lovely, thank you very much. So what we're going to do now is we'll put a link into the chat for the evaluation for the webinar, because it's always really helpful to us to understand what's worked, what hasn't, and so on. So that it's only a very simple evaluation, so it just take a couple of minutes. And in the meantime, well, I wonder whether one of you, one of the question we didn't answer from earlier was about future proofing projects. Does anybody have anything they would say about that? Just have a think. If you've got a top tip about how to future proof a project, that would be really helpful. But and then the other thing I'm going to ask each of you to thinking just more generally about embracing the unexpected. What might be your kind of final comment, either something you've heard in the webinar that's made you think, or something you haven't had a chance to say yet, or something you think will be really important. So you'll only have about a minute each when we come back from doing the evaluation. So just have a think about what your final, anything you might say about future proofing, and one final point that you'd like to get across to the audience. So I'll just give you a minute to do that while other people can fill in this survey form. And also, Louise, you were saying that you're still touring with Fame Hungry, and you might want to put something into chat about that. And Ben, I don't know if there's any, or Harmeet, if you've got any of your own work you want to share links to. That's about, I asked about 10 things all at once. I'm really sorry. Just give it a minute. And okay, let's go round. So but Ben, I'll come back to you first whenever you're ready with your kind of what would your final thought be, and anything you wanted to say, just a minute or so.
Yeah, so I think that when you work in a creative way, you're kind of prone to things, you're curiosity driven often, and things can go right and go wrong, but like, don't give yourself too much of a hard time as well. Like, I often get, like my other half hears me complain about, oh, the internet didn't work, or this wasn't quite right, or this was worded badly. But nobody's going to die if they don't like your artwork, or they didn't have a great time. There's certainly other industries that are more critical, and so like it's difficult to make new and different things. It's a difficult, it's difficult to be innovative and break new ground and make interesting work. But like, don't beat yourself up if you do fail, if things do go wrong. You won't please everybody. Like, there'll be some people who hated it, there'll be some people that loved it, and just sometimes give yourself a break. And it's always worth digging deep and persevering, but don't burn yourself out as well. So kind of be measured, I guess, is like, always give yourself an escape route, but be measured in your kind of critique of other people and yourself. And yeah, you'll never really be able to plan for all the random acts of God and other random people who will be exposed to your work. So you can never really bulletproof things.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Louise, what was a final thought from you?
I think just, after today talking about all the different projects and ways of working, I think it's just to keep curious. I think, art for me is at its most exciting when it's meeting audiences and the sort of plurality of like who we are as humans, and what we're bringing to any given piece of work on any given day. So I think be open to the sort of failure as it were, and the experiment of it all. And yeah, I sort of mentioned this earlier, but I think Fame Hungry of all my projects has just reminded me that don't get lazy as an artist. Don't think that people are going to respond in a certain way. Be open and curious to what's going to happen, and the beauty of that.
Thank you very much. And Harmeet, a final thought from you.
Yeah, well, I had a thought about the future proofing actually.
Oh, good.
Was just I think for artists, we probably don't think about this till afterwards, but just documenting your work is really, really important. Like, and people go, that's not future proofing. Future proofing is making sure that, the app or the thing on the, the software will run in 10 years' time. You can't future proof for that. You really can't, just everything, systems, operating systems, tech, it will change so much. But actually, if you document your work, if you've got really good quality video and audio, and even if all you do is you stick it on YouTube and it's in a, unlisted account, you've got an archive of your work. And that's really, really important, because one day you'll look back at it and you'll go, oh, that's really, really important. That's like my live portfolio or sketchbook, or you can refer to it all the time. So I'd say future proofing, and actually, future proofing by sticking your VR piece on YouTube 360 or whatever is really, really clever. But even if you don't want to do that and you want to keep it more exclusive, I think documenting it and keeping it somewhere where you've got access to it is really, really a wise thing to do. It's not something that I do, so I should listen to my own advice.
Always.
But also, I think, in terms of like what are kind of like the things that I think are really important. I mean, I think if you're making something new, we've heard this, if you're making a cake, then you know how to make a cake. But if you're making something new, the cake that never existed, the thing that's going to make your taste buds explode and, make people walk on air and be nice to one another in the streets rather than being angry and suspicious, whatever the new thing is that you're making, you have to break the eggs. You have to break the rules. You have to think and test. You have to play. You have to be outside of your comfort zone and outside of that box. And some of that process for you has to be enjoyable. If it doesn't, you probably should be doing something else. But if you find joy in that space and it is holding on to the joy, then you're okay. Then it's not the Victoria sponge you're making. You are making that cake that will lift everybody up, or it will make something new. And there's and I think that a lot of people kind of think about that. We haven't used any kind of corporate speak, but that whole thing of like, you can't run before you walk, but in order to run, you are technically falling forwards. And I think you have to always kind of allow yourself in that space to give yourself permission for things to go wrong. And there's a great saying, and I love this saying, this quote. I don't know who it's from, but I love it. And it always makes me think, oh, if I'm feeling the fear, not feeling the fear and doing it anyway, but if I'm like, I don't know if I should do this, or I don't know how to do this, and even the team don't know how to do this, or I don't even know if I should like try and birth it, it's in my head or it's in my heart. There's a great saying, which is, if you stand on the edge of the diving board, it won't make the water any warmer. So you just have to dive straight in.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much to all of our panel for their sort of sharing their so thoughtfully and generously. That was great. And to the audience for contributing as well. Thank you very much. And just to say...